Mark. Okay,
How are you?
recording now. Okay, Peter.
Hi, hi, Ruben.
All right.
I clicked on the wrong thing and I was watching last week's.
Okay. So, what am I doing? Share screen. Okay. No, I got the wrong one. Hang on. I have to. When I start, now I've got 3 different windows open there, so I'll just hang on. I'll get rid of 2 of them. Okay, you should be able to see that now. Yeah. Okay, so I thought something different, and
We can't see the screen, Ruben.
Sorry,
We don't see the screen. No.
you can't see it.
No,
You forgot to share the screen.
No.
No, well, I went through that. All right, try
We're
again.
not sharing. We're not
Try
sharing.
again. Try again. It's moved. It's over here.
There you go.
You got it?
Yes.
Good. Thank you.
yeah,
Better?
Yeah.
All right. So,
right.
the thing is, this is something that might challenge a little bit, extend the brain power somewhat. The musculoskeletal system is about everything about how we move and lots of other things about us. If you looked at the notes I gave you, you would have noticed that we do have 3 different types of muscles in our bodies. And I'll go through each one of this: the skeletal, the smooth, and the cardio muscle. The bones, we have different types. So I'll go through information about the bones, and then the connective tissue, which holds us together. Without a connective tissue, we'd just be a lump of, or just a blob on the ground. So let's start with the skeletal muscles. There are about 640 muscles, groups of muscles, because any one muscle is sort of made up of groups of fibers. And in a normal body, in a typical body, we have that, and they mostly are made up of pairs. And so because we're bilateral, that means if you cut us in half, the left side and the right side is basically the same. There are a little discrepancies, but it's mostly right. So it means we have around 320 pairs of muscles, and they are attached to the bones, which they move through tendons. So I'll leave explanation of tendons later, but the muscles themselves are very interesting. And the skeletal muscles are actually made of fibers, lots and lots of fibers, many thousands of them, and they're bundled together. Now, every single fiber is quite weak. It contracts when you stimulate it in a dish, looking at it, but when they work together, they can be very, very powerful. And they are organized in such a way that they have a striped pattern. And so the stripes make it look like if you like, bars in them, and they're called striated muscle. It's either skeletal because they're joined to the skeleton, or they're also called striated muscle, and that's because of the way they look. Now, they are the most important part of their job is to move us. And that's why they're attached to the skeletons. That's why they're called skeletal muscles. So when one of these muscles contracts, it allows some part. Now, my jaw is moving, my tongue is moving, So the tongue moving is not a skeletal muscle. I mean, it's not a skeleton, but it's still a skeletal muscle because it's under control. I hope it's under control. Then the other thing very important about skeletal muscles is they're voluntary. Where the others are involuntary, these are, that means you can't control them. These are voluntary, and they move as you want. If you want to move your arm or your finger or your leg, you control it. And as I said, the other two don't do that. So this is why they're called striated. They've got these stripes on them. And those stripes are very, very important because of the way they work. So they are actually made up of filaments, and they are so small, they call them microfilaments. You can only see them under a microscope. Now, this one here is under a light microscope. I don't know what the magnification is, probably a few hundred, but that's what it looks like. Now, they are made up of two types of proteins, which are called myofibrils. There's one called actin, and actin is all over the body, not just muscles, in other areas as well. It's very, very thin, at about 7 nanometers. Now, a nanometer is a thousandth of a micrometer. So a nanometer is a millionth of a millimeter. So if you can imagine a millimeter in your head, how small that is, if you can divide it up into a million parts and take one of those million, or 7 of those millions, that's about the diameter of one of these actin fibers. Okay, so there's a large number of them. And they work fast, therefore fast action. So wings of insects, they move very, very fast, and it's the actin that does that. Now, when we have cells that move, there are all sorts of cells in nature that move. The one that might come to your mind is sperm. They have strips of actin in their tail, and then they wiggle in a particular pattern. Now, some cells move in a way by moving up and down in a wave formation. Others do it in a rotary fashion, and they vary. But the main thing is cell motility. By the way, the word is motility. I haven't made a spelling mistake. It's not. It's also then mobile, but the word is motility. And also, one day I'll write a lesson on mitosis and meiosis. It's about cell division, and the chromosomes which replicate are pulled apart into the new cells through acting. And this is quite a complicated system, so I'm a little bit scared of bringing it to you, but I might give it a go. Now, the second one that we've got is called myosin, and it's a long molecule, and what it does, it converts chemical energy in the form of ATP into mechanical energy. So we produce ATP in our bodies, and this myosin converts chemical energy into mechanical energy. And that's how we move it. So actin and myosin make up, excuse me, this particular pattern here. So I've put a few diagrams in because if you haven't come across this before, it could be quite confronting. Now, so here's a diagram of just a small section of a muscle, and they've got the fibers. And if you have a look sideways, so that is a cross section of that, you've got these various bands. And that's what you saw in the microscopic photo there. And there are all sorts of names here, like the sarcomere, the myofibrils, and so on. I won't worry too much about it. The interesting thing here is this one here, the yellow bits are called a sarcoplasmic reticulum. There's no test after this, by the way. You know, but it goes right through, and it becomes a supply of energy for blood and so on. And this is just a cross section. So the sarcolemma. Now, this word comes from the Greek sarx for flesh and lemma for the sheath. So this is if you ever have some raw meat, even if you have, chicken breast, for example, you see the sheaths, the layers of membrane around, and they're called the sarcolemma. And in some books it's called myolemma. Myo, by the way, is another word for muscle. You may have heard of myotherapy. It's like what physiotherapists do, but physiotherapists do more than just muscles. So the myotherapists, people who just manipulate muscles to relieve tension or whatever they do. I've never been to one. Okay, and that's the cell membrane. The mitochondria are there, and if you remember, we talked about this some time ago. They are in most cells, and the more active the cell, the more of them there are, and they are where glucose is converted to ATP, which is our energy molecule. Now, the sarcoplasmic reticulum, okay, so that's this thing here, it constitutes the main intracellular calcium store. Now, if you are short of calcium in your diet, you get a problem because you either not be able to move your muscles or you lose calcium out of your bones. And because you can't move your muscles without calcium. So what happens is when we're moving, you'll see in this diagram, we get closer and closer. So you get a muscle, you get a muscle fiber, you get a muscle myofibril, myo meaning muscle. And I won't worry about the bands and the sarcolemma there. But what you see here is right down to the supermicroscopic level. And you only see this in an electron microscope there, so small. This absolutely thing, this absolutely tiny thing here. These are the myofilaments. So you have these dark ones and the light ones are shown gray here. So the dark one is called the myosin, and the light one is the actin. And you can see they move between each other. So what we have, the actin and the myosin, they move across each other and are moving after a nerve impulse. So your nerve impulse says, move my hand, I'm going to pick up a glass or whatever. Lots of muscles move, and so they're controlled by the nerves. And I'll get to the mechanism later, but so they actually shorten. So if you want to bend your arm or move a finger or whatever you do, you actually are making the muscle shorter. So they're moving between each other, and when you relax, they move apart. And all this, of course, requires ATP and calcium. And ATP means using glucose. So when you have a nerve signal to contract the muscle, it contracts, but when you if you want to relax it, but you stop saying pick it up or whatever you're doing, then the muscle gets longer, so it gets shorter and longer. So if you stand in front of a mirror and you put your arm up and you look at your bicep, by bringing your arm up, you're contracting it, so it becomes fatter. So you say, hey, look at that, it looks pretty good. But if you strengthen your arm, you lengthen your arm, you're actually relaxing those bicep muscles and they just become longer. So this is the example. So there are two words here, I should mention, agonist and antagonist. And I keep changing. The agonist is the one that does the movement. The antagonist is the one opposite, the partner, that relaxes. So if you do the one on the right here, when you bend your arm, you're actually using your biceps. I think there are two muscles there. You can see in this diagram, each of these has got a tendon going up to the shoulder here, and the big tendon of the two together into the radius here. So what you've got here is that. So by this muscle shortening, or the two muscles, the arm moves up, and by shortening it becomes fatter. But to be able to do that, the triceps at the back do the opposite. They relax and they become longer. So they're called the antagonists, the agonist and the antagonist. If you do then do the opposite, if you've got a weight in your hand and you or whatever, but you straighten arm, to be able to straighten it, the triceps become the agonist, and the one that's relaxing, the biceps, become the antagonist. Okay. And they have to work together. Now, if you remember some time ago, I can't remember how long ago, I did a talk on immunology, and the very first picture I showed you was a guy with tetanus. Remember, he was bent over backwards. Tetanus toxin causes every muscle in the body to contract at the same time. So imagine it's happening here. They're both contracting, and these muscles are actually very strong. And in fact, your triceps, for the three of them, are actually stronger than your bicep. But they would just snap your arm, they'd snap it off, break it. So the control is very fine. Okay, so how does this actually work? Well, when the actin fibers are pulled across, you get the contraction. So there's a little video which shows it here, but what you'll see is the myosin fiber here with a thing called the myosin head. And the actin here has got little sort of grooves that this fits into, and it moves it across. The head pushes that across, in this case, to the left here. So you've got now ATP makes sure that this works. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. There are three phosphates. And if you lose one of those phosphates, you get ADP, adenosine diphosphate. We've covered this in previous talks, but this is our energy source. The bond between this third and the second phosphate is called the high energy bond. And when that breaks, that's the energy to do something. So what happens here is this moves across when you get the ADP there. And when you get the ATP initially coming on, it straightens it out and it starts again until it breaks again. So when the ATP in the third bit here breaks, the third phosphate comes off. So you end up with ADP, diphosphate, in the third one. Then you get this motion here, and this needs calcium as well, of course. So let's see if this works.
Writing's not that easy, but Grammarly can help. This sentence is grammatically correct.
Muscle cells are comprised of protein
the video is
cylinders
not
called
working, Ruben.
myofibrils, which are
Sorry?
The video on YouTube is not coming through.
Okay. Try that. Thank you for that. Is that better? Can you see it?
Yes, that's it. That's good.
Okay, I'll take it back. Thank you.
muscle cells are comprised of protein cylinders called myofibrils, which are composed of multiple sarcomeres, short structural units arranged end to end within the myofibril. Sarcomeres are made up primarily of two types of protein filaments. Myosin, a thick filament with protrusions known as myosin heads extending laterally from the filamentous portion, and actin, a thin filament which contains active or binding sites for the myosin heads to access. Ultimately, it is the interaction of myosin and actin as myosin pulls on the actin filament that produces a power stroke, causing sarcomeres to shorten and muscles to contract. Understanding how myosin is able to move actin requires a closer look at the structure of myosin. Myosin is an ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, dependent motor protein. In muscle cells, the long tail of an individual myosin molecule is intertwined with tails of other myosin molecules, forming the thick filaments of the sarcomere. Force-producing heads protrude from the sides of the filaments, ready to bind to active sites on actin. The myosin globular heads have two possible conformations, a high-energy 90-degree form and a low-energy 45-degree form. The hydrolysis of ATP by myosin will push the myosin head from low-energy to high-energy conformations. The power stroke cycle begins when myosin binding sites on actin are exposed. The high-energy myosin head releases the inorganic phosphate ion and binds tightly to actin, forming a cross bridge. Myosin is unstable in this conformation and shifts to the low-energy form, releasing the bound ADP, or adenosine diphosphate. This conformational shift results in a power stroke as the tightly bound myosin pulls on the actin filament. In this low-energy conformation, myosin has a high affinity for ATP. As ATP is bound to the myosin head, actin is released, thus breaking the cross-bridge. The ATP-ACE activity of myosin triggers ATP hydrolysis, and the myosin head is recocked to the high-energy conformation, thus bringing the cycle back to the beginning. Because actin is tethered to structures located at the lateral ends of each sarcomere, called the Z-disc, any pulling of the actin filament results in a shortening of the sarcomere, and thus the muscle. The process of contraction will continue until the action potential is terminated. Relaxation is achieved when calcium pumps have actively transported calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, reversing the changes that previously occurred in troponin. Tropomyosin is now back in its original position, covering the myosin binding sites on actin, preventing cross bridges and power stroke cycling. It is interesting to note that since muscles store energy in their myosin heads, it is possible for muscles to contract even after death. This is the case of rigor mortis. Shortly after death, cytoplasmic levels of calcium increase due to an increase in permeability of sarcoplasmic reticulum and the sarcolemma. This calcium influx will promote cross-bridge formation and trigger power stroke cycling. The muscle fibers will ratchet shorter and shorter until ATP stores are depleted. Since ATP is needed to break cross bridges and relax muscle, the power stroke cycle will halt in the contracted state, and muscles will remain contracted until the muscles themselves begin to decompose. Depending upon temperature and other conditions, rigor mortis usually lasts about 72 hours.
For just $67, you can make as many videos as you want.
Never need to pick up a camera or use any fancy editing software. You do it, you drag.
Okay, so we're back here. No, we're not. Yeah, okay, right. So hopefully that made the story a little bit clearer. So here's just another diagram showing what we're saying. So we've got the myosin and the actin. It's relaxed and it's contracted. So
You forgot to share again.
sorry?
You forgot to share the screen.
Oh, bugger.
I'm keeping you honest.
Yes, thank you very much. Hang on. I've lost it somewhere. Here. No, which one is it? I think it's that one. No,
That's the start of it.
yeah. There's so many open here. It's really hard to know. Is that one? No, it's not doing it.
No, that's about where we were, Ruben.
What?
One was that was where we were when we went to the video.
That?
Yes.
No. I'm getting something totally different. All right. No, it's not working. All right. What I'm going to do, I'm going to delete from my screen. That wouldn't be it. No, that should be it. It's not coming up. I don't know why. I don't know what you guys are.
Try the net.
Okay. Now I've got it.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay, we're done now. So, oh yes, the tendons. So here you've got the muscle, and somehow you've got to be able to attach a muscle to the bone, because you want to move the bone, and you need to be able to have a connection which is strong enough to lift the weights that you may want to lift. If you want to lift a few hundred grams or a small number of kilos, it's not a major issue. But if you become a weightlifter and you lift 50, 60, 100 kilos, the tendon and the joint between the tendon and the muscle and the joint between the tendon and the bone must be able to support that sort of weight. So weight training actually increases the strength of all components here. But it's very easy also to tear a tendon. Either you can tear away from the bone or get a tear within it. It's one, it's painful, but two, it's quite easily fixed these days with a process, an injection, or I think called a PRP. And if you have no idea what that is, if you remind me, I'll tell you later because I've had it and it's magic. Okay, so these tendon, and people call them sinews, another one, it's very fibrous, and it itself is extremely tough, but it doesn't stretch. It can't stretch because if it keeps on stretching, it becomes weaker. So it has to be there to be able to do the work. All right, so everything else is we've seen before. Now, I thought since I'm mentioning tendons, I'll put in sprains and strains, and people don't know the difference. So a strain is an injury to a muscle or a tendon, whereas a sprain is an injury to the ligaments and the capsule at the joint in the body. So ligaments are between, for example, in the shoulder, even in the jaw, between the lower jaw and the skull, there's a bit of a ligament in there. So if we go back, if this is the capsule, because all this is within a capsule, by the way, it doesn't just sit there, it's covered. Now that would be the sprain. The strain is when you get an injury in this area here, or the muscle itself. Okay, and now the ligaments actually that connect the two bones, and I'm sure you've heard of the ACL, the anterior cruciate ligament. There's also a posterior one in the knee to stop the two bones moving sideways, so they can only move backwards and forwards. There are two ligaments which cross over like that, and that's why it's called a cruciate ligament, the cross. And the anterior one is the front one. And they are very, very tough. But if you're playing footy, for example, and you're running very fast and you decide to change direction suddenly, the stresses are too much and it just rips. You can get a partial rip or a full rip. And if the full rip, there are problems. Okay, so that's where it happens. So here we have the bone, you have cartilage in there, you have 10 ligaments, it's not shown here, but they hold those two together. And then you've got this particular one is got ligament on the outside. So like in the elbow, in the knee, you've got it on the inside. That's evolution for you. Okay, and of course, if you do get a sprain, it's called RICE. Rest, ice it, compress it, compression on elevation to stop it getting swollen. All right, so that was the first type of muscle, the skeletal muscle. The second one is involuntary, it's non-striated, and it's called smooth. Smooth muscle, it doesn't have the striations. And the whole thing, the bundle of it acts as one. And by muscle, contracting as one unit is called a syncytium. The heart muscle is also a syncytium. Now, the smooth muscles are found everywhere. And, excuse me, they actually are under your brain's control. It's not yours. It's totally involuntary. And they're found, well, in the intestines, in the stomach, the bladder, uterus, anus, penis, clitoris, all the passageways, in the walls of everything, arteries, veins, in the tracts of the trachea, the urine, I've got a blank. The ureters, the urethras, in the reproductive system, the ejaculatory duct, the ones that help ejaculation, the fallopian tubes which move the egg around, the eyes, the pupil enlarges or contracts depending on the amount of light, but the if you've got light-colored eyes, if you look in the mirror, you will see two sets of muscles. You can see them quite clearly. If you look in at your iris, you will see lines coming out in the middle, and you'll see circles. So you have circular muscles and straight muscles. They're smooth muscles, and they move very, very finely. And what they do, they either make the pupil smaller or larger to let the right amount of light in, and they're completely under involuntary control. The ciliary muscles, they're the ones that I just mentioned. And of course, in the skin, we have the smooth muscles which cause our hairs to stand up. Now, you know you've got those ciliary muscles because when it's cold, you get goosebumps. Now, a goosebump is where a hair is. And in us, it doesn't matter. We've lost the use of it. But in animals and birds, sorry, in mammals and birds, when it's cold, they can fluff up their fur, they fluff up their feathers using this mechanism, and they trap air. The air in between the feathers of the fur, the hair warms up, and it's a very good insulator. Not only that, I suppose if there's animals are afraid of something, or they're angry or about to fight, they also, the hair stands or the fur stands on end. It's all got to do with this tiny, tiny muscle. Now, the smooth muscles, they lack the striations, and this is, I'm not repeating myself here, sorry. But it's all involuntary. And again, this is the important part. I should have highlighted this. It's the contracting of the smooth muscle is initiated by a calcium complex which is formed. It also requires ATP, so it does that. But if you remove this complex, then the contractile aspect disappears and you get the relaxation. So we need calcium, ATP, and this is the opposite of it. So we get something which I haven't mentioned before. We have now neural innervation. Neural refers to nerves. Innervation is where the nerve meets, in this case, the muscle. Okay, it's being innervated. Now, autonomic nervous system, we've got the two sections of it, and that's part of the next talk. So I won't go into detail, but we have no control of it. So our temperature regulation, we can't control that. Many other things within us, we have no control, and the autonomic system does that. And smooth muscle is under autonomic control. We also have hormones that help contract smooth muscle, and then I just threw this last bit in about local chemical signals. There are signals in very small parts of the body which set off the contractions just locally. So what happens here is they also have actin, and they also have myosin, and they also need calcium, as I mentioned. But instead of being the way you saw before in straight lines, if you like, they have a cross-bridging system between the actin and the myosin. And so they all contract together, not individually. And that's the word I said before, syncytium. The other amazing thing about smooth muscle, they don't get tired. So for example, the one that you really wouldn't want to get tired is your anal sphincter. Now we have sphincters all over the body. For example, the stomach's got two sphincters, one at the top called the cardiac sphincter, and the one at the bottom, which goes, food which has been been dealt with in the stomach, goes down to the intestines for the pyloric sphincter. Now the anal sphincter makes sure that any feces in your rectum stay there. If you lose control of that anal sphincter, you have then no control at all of losing your feces when you don't want them to leave your body. Okay, they just don't get tired, whereas skeletal muscles do. So if you've ever done weights and you try and do a few more than you normally do, I mean, your muscles will complain. So what do they look like? The structure, again, they're in five groups, but they're in separate sorts of bundles. They're different. So they don't run parallel to each other. They become a complex, and these they look different. We call them cigar shapes. They're tapered at each end. I'll show you a photo, a diagram, and these cells contract much more strongly than striated ones because they work together. It's totally different. So here, for example, one of these fibers, that's a smooth fiber, smooth muscle cell, and these things are rounded, look like beads, they're called varicosities. And within the varicosity, like here, you have what are called neurotransmitters. So they actually, they're part of the nervous system, and when you want them to contract, they release some of these chemicals, neurotransmitters, and the fibers contract. But there's so many of them in normal muscles, you don't have them. In skeletal muscles, you don't have this system because you have a contraction and you finish, it relaxes. Otherwise, it's under our control, the skeletal system, and you couldn't do it with this system because it's under a different set of controls. So an axon, this word here, is comes from the part of the autonomic system. And if if I mentioned that the anal sphincter, this is releasing the neurotransmitter constantly to make sure that it's constantly tight, closed. And then if you want to release, you're sitting on a toilet and you want your poo to come out, your feces to come out, you consciously relax them. You consciously relax them. They stop releasing the neurotransmitters. Now, the neurotransmitters, by the way, here also have mitochondria, and of course, as you know, mitochondria produce the ATP, which you need to do that, to get the whole process working. So here's two pictures. That's your skeletal muscle. There's your smooth muscle. You look here, they're totally different. So you've got these cigar shapes. Now, let's move on to cardiac muscles, and which is the third form. They are also involuntary. You have very little control, if any. If you think hard enough, you can actually lower or raise your heart rate a little bit, a few beats a minute. And if you well in tune with yoga practice, you can do that, but not by many. And so this is continuous rhythmic contraction. They contract and they relax. Once they start contracting while we were all in utero, they don't stop. If they stop, well, that's the end of you. Now, this word here, cardiomyocytes. Cardio means heart, myo means body, muscle, and cytes means cell. And or cardiac cells, if you like, but that's what that means. And they are uninucleated, so they only have one nucleus. They are cylindrical and they're long. And you can, under microscope, you can faintly see some cross striations, but again, like the smooth muscle, they are involuntary and they do not get tired, which is very important. Last thing you want is your heart muscle to say, I've had enough, I'm tired, I'm having a break. Anyway, cardiac muscle just keeps on going. And and it's controlled from the brain stem and the hypothalamus, which is now the hypothalamus is sort of in the middle of the brain. It's just above the pituitary. And if you're not sure where your pituitary is, imagine taking two knitting needles or two chopsticks, and one in the temple, one between the eyes, and where the two meet is exactly where the pituitary is. And just above that is where the hypothalamus is. And the hypothalamus is very, very much involved in so many areas of the body. I won't go there, I haven't got time now. Okay, so being subconsciously or unconsciously uncontrolled is one of the main things that's, of course, different from skeletal muscle. Now, how does it keep on beating and doing it as a syncytium, all in one? So there are cells called pacemaker cells, and there are groups of them, and they control the heart. So the nervous system controls the pacemaker, and then the pacemaker sends a signal out to control. So these pacemakers are in the heart, part of the heart. So because the electrical signals from the pacemaker come from the heart, we say they are myogenic. Myo meaning muscle, heart muscle in this case, and initiated. So, so the signals from the cardiac muscle, and there are two nodes which are the pacemakers. I'll get to them in a sec. So they generate signal one after the other. The first one signals the second one, but there's a time lapse. So the first one is called the sinoatrial node. And it's in the right atrium. Now, I'll show you all this in a sec, the SA node, and then this is the bit that contracts the two atria. So here we are. I found this lovely little, it's a repetitive thing. So here's the SA node up the top. The two top chambers are the atria, left and right. And it sends a signal to the AV node, but the AV node has a delayed mechanism. So when this sends a signal there, it also sends a signal to the muscle around the two atria. They contract, they push the blood from the atria into the ventricles, and then that's enough time for the AV node then to signal all this massive muscle here, the ventricles, to contract, and then the ventricles push the blood out. It's a very good diagram in many ways. And one of the things I'd like to point out to you is that you notice the left ventricle has got a much thicker wall than the right ventricle. The right ventricle doesn't have to push the blood far. It only goes as far as the lungs. So it pushes blood through the lungs. The left ventricle pushes the blood right through the whole body. So it needs much stronger power. It also has small little areas, little nerves coming off the main one, so that these all contract at the same time and with whatever power they've got. So just reiterating, the right muscle, the right atrium moves the blood into the right ventricle, the left atrium to the left ventricle. Where have I gone? What have I done? Nothing. Okay. I thought there was something missing back there. The second one, the AV node, is called atrioventricular node. That's so the atrium and the ventricle, and it's sure that the ventricles contract simultaneously. So the right ventricle pushes its contents into the pulmonary artery. Now, the pulmonary means lungs. And the blood that's going from the right ventricle to the lungs is deoxygenated blood. Means it's, instead of having 21% oxygen, it's only got 17%, and it goes to the lungs to be reoxygenated. And the left ventricle then takes the blood from the lungs and moves into the aorta, which goes around the body, the arms, the head. Now, this is an interesting little diagram here. So here's a heart, the AV node, the sinoventricular, sorry, the atrioventricular node, AV, so the SA and AV. So this triggers the thing, the signal, and it goes in through there. The next one, the signal goes down. It's called a bundle of His. I won't worry about that. And then these other fibers, which I mentioned, I didn't want to give you too many names. They're called the Purkinje fibers, all the simultaneously, and then this contracts. All right, so there are only two of these, and because the signal from there to there is instantaneous, but this has got a mechanism to delay the signal by a small amount. So the ventricles contract after the atrium. So this is what we've got. Now, the right atrium has has got these valves here, and there are three parts. We call the tricuspid valve, and it goes into the right ventricle. The reason the color blue, because deoxygenated blood is always colored blue. If you cut your hand, you see blood somewhere, it's sort of a darkish color red, and that's deoxygenated blood. If you cut an artery, which I hope you never ever see, it's crimson color. It's a very different color. It's very bright. That's the oxygen in it. So from here, the right ventricle, it goes up here through these valves, and it goes to the left. This is a pulmonary artery, and that's the left, and the right goes to the lungs. It comes back through the pulmonary veins in here, and there are two more here, but they come behind, and they go into the left atrium. And here, like the right atrium has three what are called leaflets, three parts. This has only got two. Now the way these two are set, they're like that. They when the guys first started cutting hearts up and looking at the anatomy, it reminded them of the mitre that popes and other high people in the Catholic Church wear. So they're like that, those hats. They're called mitres. So they called this valve the mitral valve. And so the heart then, so the atrium, the left atrium pushes the blood through the mitral valve into the left ventricle, and then goes into the aorta. Now this is the aortic valve. And they're generally two valves, either this one or this one, because they're under a lot of pressure all the time that have to be either repaired or replaced. And I've actually had this one repaired, the mitral valve. And I had an amazing surgeon. He didn't open me up, just pushed that in from the side. It was all done robotically, but using his hands, not the robot. So from there, he goes in here. The first set of arteries from here come down to feed the heart, and then the others go to the head and other parts of the body.
Sorry, Ruben, there are errors there, but when you explain it next time, can you just show with your error how it goes, how blood circulates, and what I mean?
Where the arrows go?
Well, the arrows is here. It's all on the picture. But if you can also point it your arrow from
Sure. Okay. So
sorry.
no problem at all. Okay, this is very straightforward. From the atrium to the ventricle, from this ventricle, it goes up here through this valve, and that goes up to these. This one goes behind. That goes to the lungs. And then from the lungs, it comes back. There are no arrows here. It comes back to the.
Sorry, Ruben. I think you are using a pointer, which it's not coming through onto our system.
You can't see that?
No, have you got a pointer you're using?
I'm using a,
Yeah, I think you're using a different screen than what is actually being shared.
can you see it there?
Now the pointer came out. Yes.
Because some time ago I was told that I was using this one early on in my Zoom talks, and people couldn't see that. And I said, so then I started using this one, and everybody saw that. So, all right.
No, the pointer's working now.
Okay. So this is okay here. So right atrium, blood goes into the right ventricle, comes up through this valve, goes to the left lung, I've lost it there, and the right lung. And from the lungs, it comes back through the 1, 2, 3, 4 pulmonary arteries. Now, I should mention pulmonary veins, sorry. I must mention the difference. An artery, by definition, there are two definitions. One is that arteries carry blood away from the heart, and they also carry oxygenated blood. Veins carry blood towards the heart, and they carry deoxygenated blood. And there are two exceptions, and they're here. Now, this pulmonary artery, it means it's taking blood away from the heart, there and there, it goes to the lungs, is it carrying deoxygenated blood. These are the two arteries that carry deoxygenated blood. All the others in the body, they carry oxygenated. And then the veins that come back from the lungs, the pulmonary veins, by definition, carry deoxygenated blood. But because these four veins, I've lost it, four veins, those two and those two, carry oxygenated blood, that's the other exemption. So we have the blood coming through here into the left atrium, through the mitral valve, and then up here through the aortic valve into the aortic, and this is called the aortic arch. Before, it's not shown in the diagram, before it gets to this area here, the blood comes off and goes into the arteries that feed the blood, the coronary arteries. I think I've got a diagram further down. And then some of these, then there's more than these. So they go to the head. So one goes, they become the carotid arteries up the neck. Behind the ear, they split. You get the anterior and posterior. And then you also get the what are they called? I think subclavian. The one that go under the shoulders into the arms, become the femoral arteries and so on. Is that okay? So they are. Let's go back one sec. Remember here, we've got the atria. Oops, wrong one. Atria contracting, and then there's a delay for the ventricles to contract. Then, if you think about it, if they're all one unit, why isn't the signal to make these contract also contract these? And that's where we are now, because there's a fibrous, non-conducting layer between the atria and the ventricles. Okay, they've got they're insulated electrically, and so when the atria contract, The ventricles don't. They have to wait a second, a fraction of a second. So here's an article, a diagram where you've got this blue. It's not blue, by the way, but drawn here. It's non-conducting. So the SA node here sends signals right, of course, right through the to atria. They contract. It also sends a signal to the AV node. I've lost the AV node here, but the delay is because of this layer here. Okay. The only name, I haven't found a name for it, but they're calling it non-conducting tissue. And then what we said before. I should also, this diagram has these, if you can see here, there, and these three here, there are tendons which move up in all of these, attached to the leaflets, which make up the valves of between the ventricles and the atria. Now remember, this one's the mitral valve. It's got 2 leaflets. This is the tricuspid. It's got 3 leaflets. And down here is where they are attached. Over time, especially in the left ventricle, because of the pressure, so when this contracts, the leaflets move up to stop the blood going back from both sides. They can't go back into the atrium. And over time, these tendons, they're called tendonae, they actually stretch a little bit. And then sometimes when the 2 leaflets don't quite meet, you get what's called regurgitation going back. And over time, the regurgitation gets worse and worse, and you get a backflow, back pressure into the lungs. So that's when you have to have this particular valve repaired or replaced. When I had mine repaired, my amazing surgeon, he took 2 bits of a special plastic. It's the stuff they use in sailing boat sails. I can't remember what it's called now. And he made 2 U-tendinate for me. So they met. If your doctor ever tells you that you've got a murmur, this is what he's referring to. A murmur is he can hear the regurgitation. And they'll send you off to a thing called an echocardiogram, which is an ultrasound with colors which show the direction of movement of a liquid, in this case, blood. So normally the blood moves in this direction. I can't remember the color, but if it moves in the other direction, it's a different color, and they can see very clearly the situation. So I mentioned before, the cardiac muscle is a sensitive, so each section contracts simultaneously. You can't have it any other way, otherwise it just would push it out. And here we have the cardiac muscle, and as just this diagram, and this is an actual microscopic and electron microscopy. So as you can see, if you remember what the skeletal muscle looks like, it's nothing like that. It's got the bands in it, slide bands, but these all are intertwined, so everything works together. So you've got, they're called intercalated discs. What they do, they sort of keep everything together. Everything moves together. The signal moves through here, and of course the ubiquitous mitochondrion. And so the nucleated, they work really well, but this particular structure has evolved so you get the syncytium. It's not unlike the smooth muscle, but it's a different situation. So here's another little video I'll show you. I will pause and go to it. And where did it go? I think this one. No. You know what? I'll have to. I should be able to see it, and I can't see it. Maybe I'll start it, then I'll know what I'm looking for.
The heart is
Okay. Okay, there we are. I think. Yep.
unique in that it never tires and is able to generate its own electrical impulses without the need for stimulation from the central nervous system. The heart is said to be myogenic, meaning it is able to generate its own impulses. These impulses are initiated at the sinoatrial node, or SA node, often referred to as the heart's pacemaker. The SA node is a small mass of specialized muscle tissue found in the right atrial wall. When an electrical impulse is initiated, it sends a wave of excitation through the atria, causing the heart to contract. This is known as atrial systole. Eventually, the impulse reaches the atrioventricular node, or AV node. This is another specialized mass of tissue that electrically connects the right atrium and right ventricle. There is a slight delay as the impulse passes through the AV node to allow time for the atria to fully contract and fill the ventricles. The nerve impulse is then passed from the AV node down the septum. Specialized nerve tissues, called the bundle of His, conducts the impulse through the septum to the tip of the ventricles. The impulse is then passed on to smaller branches that spread through the wall of the ventricles and eventually reaches the Purkinje fibers. The Purkinje fibers conduct the impulse to the ventricles, causing ventricular systole, pumping blood out of the aorta and around the body. Learn more and test yourself with our simple online quizzes at teachpe.com.
Okay. Right. Okay, so this is a diagram of the three types of muscles. So the skeletal in bands, the band is that way, but also there's this in fibers running along each other. Here, the cardiac muscle is a syncytium, and also the smooth muscle. They overlap in a particular way that they also act as a syncytium. So they're all different. So let's go into bones, something a bit different. And they are really much more than they are scaffolding for the body. They're all sorts of shapes and sizes, and they have many, many roles. So here we have, I found two diagrams. This is one where we have the different types of bones. So we get flat bones, like this and there around the place, the head, chest, the hip. The sesamoid, that's like the kneecap, it's a floating bone, it's not joined to anything. There are short bones in the hand, the feet, long bones, arms and legs, and there are irregular bones, the spinal cord, not spinal, in the vertebrae. And then you've got the numbers here. The skull has actually 22 bones. And in utero, the bones of the skull are not joined together. They're held together by cartilage. And the bones are very, they can be pushed together quite easily. So when the baby is born, the skull isn't rigid. It can move a little bit. The bones can move towards each other quite a bit, and allows an easy birth. The vertebral column has got 33. I should mention that down the bottom here, the coccyx and all the other bits and pieces, they are made up of a number of bones, which in animals with tails are separated, so they can have each bone can move along its next bones next to it. But for us to be able to walk vertically, that's the structure we got. The pelvic girdle and the lower limbs have 62 bones. The shoulder girdle and the upper limbs, 64 bones. Thoracic cage, 25. And that one's easy to explain because we've got 12 ribs on each side, 12 pairs, 24 plus the sternum. So we have 206 bones. So the bones, the outside of the bone is solid bone. And it's got some small canals, so you get some movement there. But the inside is what's called trabecular, and it's got a scaffolding, and it looks like honeycomb. So it's got spaces in it, and the spaces are filled with fluid, which is bone marrow cells. And these bone marrow cells make the blood, and then there are also fat cells there. So all blood is made in is all made in the bones, but not all bones, just generally the big bones, the long bones. They make the various blood cells. Some cells actually, most cells mature in the marrow. Some have to move somewhere else to mature. So this is what the spongy bone, trabecular, and there's the bone marrow here inside. So now this word here, the epiphyseal line, that's the growth line. So as a bone grows, it grows from that line. So with the long bones, when you're a baby, you're this big to a 5 foot, 6 foot person, the bones have to grow, and that's where they grow from. And this is what the trabecular, this section here, looks like. It's like a sponge. And the cortical bone is the outside bit here, which is solid. But it's full of blood. Blood supply. Bone is not like a piece of wood or a piece of metal. It's actually a living thing and needs to be supplied. It's got a nerve supply, a blood supply. So if you've ever broken a bone, you know how much it hurts. So, despite people think, it's not much, it's very living, it's very active, and it's constantly being remodeled. And they have many functions. Now you've got support. They also protect the vital organs. So of course you've got the ribs protecting the lungs. You've got the pelvis protecting the reproductive organs and movement, of course. And they also provide the environment in the marrow to produce and store the blood cells. And there's also a large store of minerals, many minerals, but mainly the most important one is calcium. As many women know, once I was going to say puberty. No, what's the word? When they stop being in a reproductive age, the word escapes me. Anna, help me. Can't hear you.
Osteoporosis?
Yes, I'm leading up to that.
Oh, okay.
Menopause?
Menopause.
Okay, what about menopause?
Oh.
Menopause.
Okay.
That's the first word today. I couldn't remember. Menopause. It changes the. Felicia, welcome back.
Thank you.
So when menopause comes, the hormone concentrations change in the woman, and that affects the ability of the bones to hang on to the calcium, and that leads to osteoporosis. Now, the porosis means that you get big pores in osteo means bone, and they become porous, and they can become thin and brittle, and they break easily. And there are ways around it to stop that or reduce the effect. But the calcium is lost, that's the problem. So what we got here, at birth, we've got about 270 soft bones. And as we grow, some of them fused, like the skull. And in total, we have, after fusion is finished during the growth period with kids, we have 206 bones. The largest, of course, are the femurs or thigh bones, and the smallest are the stapes, the three ossicles inside the ear. And each side we have three little bones, and what they do, they change these three bones change the amplitude, the size of the movement of the eardrum into a force, so they can actually force that and the particular the frequency and how quickly they move into the fluid in the inner ear, and that's how we hear, because that's where the nerves are. But that's another story, another time. So this stapes, which is this is what's called the stirrup, is tiny. It's only 3 millimeters long, very small. And there are two others. They also have a protein called collagen right through them, which has it's fairly soft, and then the mineral, the calcium phosphate, which is the hard part of it, but it fills in the collagen. So 99% of the body's calcium is in the bones and the teeth. And I should mention this. So the inside is, I mentioned the honeycomb. So they're fairly light, but they're still very, very strong. Now, I should mention that in birds, to be able to fly, they can't have bones like this. Is flying birds, not non-flying birds. Their bones are actually hollow, So they can, they can't, if they have bones like ours, they'd be too heavy to fly. So what happens is they have hollow bones, but have other areas which perform the function of blood formation and so on. Okay, now this is very interesting. They're not static. They're constantly being remodeled. So they break down and they get reformed and remade. So we have three types of cells which do this. I put, it's really interesting. So I put it in, and I'll give you three new names. Osteo means bone, and the blast means formation. They make bone. So they they make new bones, and older bones which have lost their function and they get broken down. The osteoblasts make new ones. The osteocytes, they're inactive osteoblasts, so they're being constantly made, and after a while the osteoblasts stop their function and they get broken down. So the ones that are waiting in line, they're there, they're inactive, and they're all connected together, and and there's a stack of different sort of hormonal communication within bone tissue, because the bone tissue needs to know within itself when to make new bone, when to break down old bone, and of course the blood making process is involved. Then there's a third set of cells. So the osteocytes become the osteoblasts. Okay, the osteoclasts, they're big cells. They have more than one nucleus, and their job is to break the bone down, the old bone. And what they do, they produce enzymes which they release, and they also release acids which dissolve the minerals, and they digest them. It's like the white blood cells that, if you like, find non-self, something that has attacked the body. They will they'll surround them and dissolve them, digest them. Now this is called resorption, not absorption. Resorption means the body resorbs the cell, and not the cell, sorry, the contents of the cell. And so the osteoclasts help remodel. So if you break a bone, then you end up with dead bone tissue. Remember, it's living. So the dead bone tissues are broken down, and the osteoblasts put the new ones in. They create new ones, new pathways, putting nerve cells, blood cells. It all fits in very nicely. Now the marrow is not all bones have marrow. Only where they were called cancerous, spongy. So the marrow, it makes around, we're not really counting every one of them, but about 2 million red blood cells every second. I'll let that sink in. 2 million. We are so active. Now, if 2 million red blood cells are made every second, we have to break down the old ones. So the old ones are broken down in your liver, about 2 million every second. But nothing goes to waste. The bits and pieces are recycled through the body. And a lot of the bits that can't be recycled, and one of the items is bilirubin, nothing to do with my name, but different spelling. But that's what's called bilirubin, and that goes through the bile, and the bile the gallbladder, which holds the bile, then goes into the small intestine and helps break down fats. And the bone marrow also produces lymphocytes. And these are the white blood cells that are involved in the immune system, which we've talked about. And they, remember, the lymph system and the sites means cell. So these are the cells that are really involved in the lymphatic system. And they have, the bones serve many, many functions. So they have mechanical, so they support us. So we have muscles, tendons, ligaments, the whole business. And we talked about this a little bit earlier. And then we get protection. Of course, you get protection for the brain, the ribs, the heart, the lungs. They are also synthesizing. So we talk about the red blood cells, the platelets, the white blood cells. They're being produced in the bones, and they have a metabolic function. So they store the minerals that are in excess in the body, so the body can actually get them to come back. They store fat. Remember, we mentioned fat is in the bone marrow. In fact, I remember when I was a kid, my grandmother used to make beef bones from which she bought and boil them up, and then because the bones were cut up by the butcher, there were little segments, and you could see the marrow. And my grandmother used to blow the marrow out onto bread and salt and pepper. And it just came back to me. I hadn't thought about that for years.
Had similar experience.
You had the same experience.
Yeah.
Well, my grandmother is Hungarian, so it's not far from probably where you're from. Now, it also it looks after the pH balance of the body. It has a detoxification or detoxifying function. It also has an endocrine function, and of course, it controls the calcium balance in the whole body. So we have long bones. These are mostly they're compacted with a little bit of marrow, but these bones tend to be supportive. But it's things like they do some metabolic function, but when they have a lot of supporting weight, it's more the support. The short bones, they have a thin layer of compact, but things like the ankle and the wrist, where there are many, many bones in the carpals, the metacarpals, and in the feet with the tarsals and the metatarsals, they're very small. You get flat bones, the bones are thin and curved, like and they have an inner layer of spongy bone. So things like the skull and the sternum, and they're protective. The sesamoid bones, and they're embedded in the tendons, the kneecaps, the patella, and they protect the tendons from wear and tear, because the patella, when you move your knee, if you bend your knee, the patella makes sure that it follows the groove at the top of your knee, the leg, right? And they're irregular bones, they're odd shapes, and they're all over the place in the pelvis and the spine. And about the remodeling, about 10% of our skeleton is replaced every year. Not that you've broken them, but they become old. Remember the cells? They become old, they get replaced. And you can fix damaged sections, reshape things. And if you are doing some weight training, or if you're doing running or walking with a strong hitting the heel, hitting the footpath strongly, then you will get thicker bones, because the bone gets built to prevent any breakages. So you've got to be careful with, I was going to say, oh, this is what I was just saying, yeah, but the thickness of the bone increases when there's stress. And of course, the remodeling is under control of many hormones. So parathyroid, that's what, the parathyroids are behind the thyroid gland, and that controls calcium. Calcitonin is a hormone, vitamin D, estrogen in women, that's what I was talking about before, and testosterone. Now, the blood, I've mentioned a couple of times that the bones have blood supply and nerve supply. And the coating is very rich with blood and vein, with blood and nerves. Osteoporosis. I just realized what the time is. I'm running out of it. So as estrogen in females decreases, you get a thinning and increase of fractures. And I think I've covered all that. And also, if you don't have enough vitamin D and calcium, excessive use of alcohol and tobacco all affect the thickness of the bone. And I don't know if you remember, if you're my age, you probably might remember walking down the street, you see little old ladies in front of you and their legs are not straight, they're bowed. And when they were in the early 20th century or in the 19th century, little girls were dressed from neck to foot, and they had very little exposure to sunlight. And without the vitamin D, which the sun would produce in the skin, their bone, which is quite plastic when they're young, oh, where's my throat? As the little girl grows older and gets heavier, the femur, the big bone, bends. So they look like the legs are bowed. So here's the left, what osteoporosis looks like. The left one, the left diagram is a normal one. Then over time, it loses a lot of calcium and becomes thinner and more frail. I thought, now the connective tissue, we have three: tendons, ligaments, and cartilage. I mentioned tendons and ligaments before, but they are actually they're actually made of cells, and they protein fibers, and this thing called amorphous ground substance. And no matter where I look, that's all they called it. And then together they form this extracellular matrix. I've got a diagram here. So you've got a few cells around, but you've got this matrix here which holds it together. It's really tough. They've got collagen and they've got so elastic fibers so that they can move around, but they're very, very tough. So the definitions: tendons attach muscles to bones, and they also attach muscles to other things like the eyeballs. We have full control of the 6 sets of bones around, 6 sets of muscles around each eyeball, so we can move wherever we want to and look wherever we want to. Ligaments, they're fibrous and they connect bone to bone. So I mentioned the cruciate ligaments between in the knee, crossover. They're very, very tough. They're hard to break, hard to snap. I've done it. Not nice. Cartilage is soft, so cartilage is in the nose, the ear, all over the body. You get cartilage between bones. You also have it in the jaw, lower jaw, and the skull. You get cartilage pads. So it stops the joints, the bone rubbing against each other, and it stops. It helps the smooth movement of the bone. Now sciatica, quite a few of us would have had that. When you get compression of the sciatic nerve, and it radiates down where the pressure is. So somewhere there, the sciatic nerve comes out of 3 places. You get where the red mark is, you get this terrible pain. So here you've got the what's called a bulging disc. It's herniated there, it's pushing in there. So these are discs in the spinal cord. There's the nerve fibers, and if you do that and it pinches on the sciatic nerve, you get sciatica, and it's treatable. It's treatable, but it's very painful. Oh, last one. We're done. Okay. So guys, it's 11:30. I managed to rush the last little bit. I hope you didn't mind, but that was and I enjoyed doing that. It's a lot of fun putting all that together. I probably left some things out. Next time I look at it in a year or two, I'll modify it. The next one I'm working on is the nervous system, how the nerves work, and how signals move around the body, controlled by the brain. Look at structures. And Alan, I hope you enjoyed that and you got something out of it. And so, guys, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Ruben.
Oh,
Good.
Thank you, Ruben. It was really good.
There's
Very
Matt now. This is being recorded, and Chris Pereira, he's the course coordinator, and another guy called Richard. They've worked out how to actually find the link to the talk that's being recorded. Now, I sent them all to you. I don't know if you've had a look at the one that I sent 2 weeks ago, but I look at it again and I couldn't get it going. I contacted the guys. I said, "What's wrong? Is there a limit on the length of time it's available?" They said they don't know. I rang a friend yesterday who is very, very au fait with Zoom. She said, yes, I think it's a 2-week limit. And so what she's told me is to download it into your computer, and then it stays there and you don't need a link or anything, but a link does come with it initially. So I haven't done it. I'm not an expert yet in that area. Once I know how to work something, I'm okay. But this is, remember, we just started the recording process.
The problem is once you've worked out how to do it, that they'll change it on you.
Yes. Anyway, this has worked fine, and I haven't tried downloading it from. I tried recording it to my computer, but then I couldn't find it. It doesn't tell me where it puts it. That's another story. So learning, and guys, have a lovely fortnight.
Thank you. And you too.
And I'll see you next week.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good
Bye all.
fortnight, everyone.
All the
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye. Bye-bye.
Okay, I will end it now.
Leave.